Welcome to all colleagues from all corners, donors, private sector, education sector, civil society, and beyond. Thank you for joining us for this Global Education Learning Series, EduFinance, Findings and Lessons from the Non-State School Sector. I'll be your moderator today, but before we get started with our panel, I'd like to introduce Julie Cram. Julie Cram is the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, and Senior Coordinator of United States International Basic Education Assistance. Her portfolio includes the offices of Education and Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Amit, and hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on EduFinance, Findings and Lessons from the Non-State School Sector. This panel discussion is part of USAID's Global Education Learning Series, and we are excited that so many of you have joined today to hear directly from practitioners and researchers about the non-state school sector. As many of you know, there has been rapid growth in the non-state schools in recent years. Growth in this sector is concentrated in low and lower middle income countries and is often driven by a variety of challenges, including demographic trends, governments' constrained fiscal space, and conflict and crisis situations. Before we start today's panel and hear directly from our panelists about their work and research, I want to reiterate that USAID is committed to improving learning outcomes and expanding access to quality education for all children and youth. This is an ambitious vision, and no single intervention, policy change, investment, approach, or method is sufficient to achieve it. USAID focuses most of its work on strengthening education systems in partner countries in line with their unique needs and context. The vast majority of this work is directed towards public education systems. However, we recognize that affordable non-state schools, including not-for-profit, for-profit, faith-based, and community schools can and do play an important role in education, especially in low-income countries where there is a lack of adequate financial resources, further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. This is for two primary reasons. First, non-state schools already account for a significant proportion of enrollment in our partner countries. Second, there is nearly a $2 trillion gap in financing for education in low and middle income countries. The vast majority of this gap will not be made up by donors, but rather must be made up through domestic resource mobilization and expanded private sector investment. Not engaging with non-state schools would mean missing out on a tremendous opportunity and would result in not reaching large swaths of school-age populations in the places where we work. Our mission staff need the flexibility to engage with a diverse set of partners to meet the unique needs of each country. As always, USAID's work and each partner will be held at the same level of accountability, transparency, and quality. Furthermore, it is essential that policymakers, donors, and funders have a better understanding of non-state schools, their strengths, their weaknesses, and the quality of education they offer. That is why USAID is committed to strengthening the evidence base around non-state schools. This panel discussion helps further that goal by bringing together practitioners and researchers. Panelists will discuss lessons from their work with non-state schools, government partners, and communities, as well as findings from their research. We know that this topic is of interest to many governments and organizations around the world, and I hope today's panel discussion helps move this conversation forward. To that end, and lastly, I also want to let you know that USAID's Blended Finance in the Non-State Education Sector Literature Review was recently published on EduLinks. That's USAID's learning website. And that is, the website is edu-links.org. So please check it out when you have a few minutes. Thank you again for joining us today. I will stay on and listen as long as I can and look forward to hearing how this discussion moves this topic forward for your time and attention. Amit.
Thank you, Julie. Hello again, everyone. Good morning or good day. My name is Amit Brar. I lead the EduFinance activity under the Catalyze project implemented by the Palladium Group. I'm so glad you could all join us today, including my panelists, for this panel discussion on EduFinance findings and lessons learned from the non-state school sector. So as you heard just now from Julie, the funding gap remains immense. No one funder, no one organization can provide all the funds needed for finishing the job here. And non-state schools form a very significant share of the overall education market. And not engaging with the non-state schools would mean missing out on a tremendous opportunity. And so for today's panel, we've got a very diverse group. We've got a funder, a private funder, as well as a public funder. We've got an implementer and a researcher from different corners of the world to share what they are seeing in this sector and what lies ahead. And in terms of introducing my panelists, rather than reading out their biodata, I think we'll do something different today. We will have them speak a little bit about their work. That gives a better insight into what they're doing. So I'm just going to start by naming my different panelists, introducing them briefly, and have each of them speak a little bit about their journey, how they came to the non-state education sector, and a little bit about their current work. So let me start by introducing to you first Nirav Khambati. He is the managing partner at Kaizenvest EduFinance in Singapore, and it's an education investment firm that is focused on emerging Asia as well as Africa. Nirav, why don't you tell us how you got involved in the non-state education sector, and if you would like to share something exciting that you're currently working on in this area. So Nirav,
sure.
Over to you.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here, and my compliments to USAID for so explicitly recognizing the role of non-state education. Very progressive move indeed. My association with the sector began in my previous job, where we created digital teaching aids for teachers of these affordable schools in India, worked with about 5,000 of such schools, which collectively catered to over 4 million students. And as part of that activity, we ran a leadership program for principals of these schools, understood their challenges, aspirations, and it was very enlightening. I'm very grateful to Kaizenvest for then giving me an opportunity to continue with the sector in my new role. And what we are doing here is perhaps best illustrated through this diagram that I have. If I may please request that we put up the first slide. What we're trying to achieve here is bring to the affordable learning providers what we call as value-added debt, which is a combination of three things: affordably priced debt, which they can use for their working capital needs, for their capital requirements, because we know that the entrepreneurs who run these organizations have very little savings of their own, because most of them are ex-teachers. Along with debt, they provide capacity building support so that they're able to quickly ramp up quality, and therefore we don't end up with the same issue that sometimes we've had with public systems where access is achieved but quality lags behind. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we bring rewards and recognitions for those entities that are able to demonstrate sustained learning outcomes improvement. And collectively, this instrument, Kaizenvest EduFinance, we are hoping that we'll be able to soon trial with USAID's support in South Africa. That's it, Amit. Back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Nirav. Welcome. Look forward to hearing more about Kaizenwitz's model along the way in this discussion. Next, we have Arjun Upadhyay. Arjun is an education specialist and program officer at Results for Development with over 7 years of experience working on education sector analysis and reform in Africa and Asia. Arjun, welcome. Would you like to tell us how you got involved in non-state education and something that you're working on in the sector that you would like to share?
Absolutely. Many thanks, Amit. It's a pleasure to be here. I got involved in non-state education 4 years back when Results for Development conducted a needs assessment of low-fee private schools in Ghana. For that study, we interviewed non-state school proprietors to better understand the challenges that they face, and we found out that only 33% of schools in our sample were profitable. Infrastructure was often cited as a critical need for investment, and that revenue streams of schools were not diversified, so they relied heavily on tuition and canteen fees. That research led to a few follow-up projects and my start of my involvement in the sector. Like many of us, my work in the past few months has pivoted in response to COVID-19. I've supported research on the use of ICT in education, both during the summer when the majority of schools were closed, and now as part of government's plan to reopen schools. Thanks again, Amit. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course, and welcome, Arjun. So glad you could join us. Next, we have Boyega Ilusanya, who is at present an independent consultant representing Cambridge Education on this panel and has 27 years experience working in the education sector. Boyega, welcome. Would you like to say a little bit about how you got involved in the sector and what's something exciting that you're currently working on?
Thank you, Amit. I got involved through a DFID funded project that Cambridge Education implemented in Nigeria. And that project was tagged Education Sector Support Program in 2009. ESPIN was designed to tackle issues of planning, education quality, and access and equity issues in public schools, with a view to ultimately bring about improvement in learning outcomes. While dealing with the public sector education issues in Lagos, Nigeria, we realized under access and equity component that there appears to be a huge set of providers unharnessed that has implication for access and equity, and they are non-state providers. And the data about the scale of involvement was not adequately captured, as many were unapproved, operating below government radar. Lagos State captured data of schools that were approved only during that period. This absence of comprehensive data generated claims and counterclaims. We had to unmask this by supporting the state to conduct comprehensive census in 2010-2011 session, capturing both approved and unapproved schools. And I ended up supervising this census that led to discovery of 12,098 schools, enrolling approximately 1.4 million children by non-state sector, representing 57% of total enrollment, from kindergarten by non-state sector, representing 57% of total enrollment from kindergarten to secondary level. Thereafter, I stepped forward to be involved in developing effective private education in Nigeria, which experimented market systems approach to improving education for children from low-income households. All the reports of the work of DeepIn can be found in www.deepin-nigeria.org. At the moment, I'm involved with some non-state schools to respond to challenges of COVID-19, designing appropriate responses that are suitable to their type of client and the income level of the household which they serve, to reduce inequality in learning and opportunities during this pandemic.
Thank you, Boyega. Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. We'd love to hear more about your experience. I think it was a very rich project that you ran. Tons of experience, tons of learnings for everyone. So look forward to you sharing more about it. Finally, we have Suzanne Lee. Suzanne is the Senior Education Finance Specialist in the Office of Education in the Economic Growth, Education and Environment Bureau at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Suzanne, welcome. I'd love to hear you say your experience of how you came to get involved in non-state education and something exciting that you are currently working on. Suzanne? Suzanne, can you unmute yourself, please?
So I just want to say USAID has worked extensively with non-state actors, especially in the 1990s. USAID worked directly with community schools in West Africa and integrating them into the government. I myself directly got involved in this work in 2004 when I was detailed to the International Finance Corporation, reviewing their work on non-state actors, both at the higher education and basic education levels. And with Professor James Tooley, who published a seminal multi-country study that showed the existence and growth of the affordable private schools in low-income countries. At that time, most thought these private schools were primarily for the wealthy. We have grown extensively in our knowledge about this sector. Currently, I'm really thrilled to share about the Catalyze EduFinance program that I'm serving as the activity manager. It is a buy-in under a USAID contract that was issued in October 2019 to Palladium. The main aim of Catalyze Education Finance is to strategically use limited donor funds to mobilize greater private capital for the non-state education sector so that we could see improved learning outcomes for the disadvantaged children and youth in low-income countries. Under this program, there are three main activities. First, a set of country-level incubation projects in Zambia, South Africa, DRC, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Secondly, we have established a community of practice. So if you haven't joined, please join on LinkedIn. That brings together key stakeholders to build a body of evidence, toolkits, and knowledge products. And as Julie mentioned, one product is the Blended Finance Literature Review that can be found on EduLinks. And thirdly, we are building an investment platform that brings together investors and investees in furthering education investments. Thanks. Over to you, Amit.
Thank you, Suzanne. Welcome. And I want to stay with you, Suzanne. I want to start off with our first topic of the day and maybe get your thoughts on it. The pandemic and its impact on education is on everyone's mind. And I thought that would be a first place to start, a good place to discuss. We are hearing about the impact of the pandemic on the schools, the school closures, impact on the financial status of these schools. We are hearing about estimates from the GEMS report that recently was put out of a much larger financing gap. We are hearing about the disruption in education for the students. And I'm curious from each of your, positions, your places, as you are listening and hearing about what's going on in the market, would you like to share, and I'll start with you, Suzanne, would you like to share what you are seeing as the impact of COVID on the non-state education? And what are some of the things that you are seeing non-state education do in response to the pandemic, rising up to this challenge? So, Suzanne?
Yeah, that's right, Amit. So, as you indicated, due to the pandemic, the recent Global Education Monitoring Policy paper estimates that there will be a shortfall of $148 billion annually to meet SDG 4 instead of the $39 billion annual gap pre-pandemic. This paper and the impact survey conducted by the Global Schools Forum, which is the only global membership group that focuses on non-state education sector in developing countries, clearly showed that there were major financial impacts on non-state schools, like, of course, for the public schools as well. Parents are unable to pay school fees. School owners are not able to cover rent. Those schools that have international grant sponsors fared better. They obtained funds from these benefactors to continue distant education. Others are clearly struggling. Secondly, the pandemic has clearly impacted the learning on the students. Those non-state schools that have students in hard-to-reach places have had more difficulties in delivering education. They have had to turn to low-tech solutions, from tapping into smartphones owned by distant relatives and friends, or use the radio. In some cases, the non-state schools have been quite resourceful and constructive, such as the Rising Academies, who has worked in partnership with governments of Sierra Leone and Liberia to share the existing structured curriculum content that was originally developed from the Ebola crisis is now being delivered through the radio and SMS. Since many non-state schools are ensconced in communities, some were able to rapidly respond to the crisis by providing holistic interventions, such as disseminating accurate health information to community, providing families with food, providing soap, and providing distant education services. Over to you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Suzanne. I do want to turn next to Nirav, but before I do that, I want to remind the audience that please put in any questions that you have in the chat box. We'll be discussing different topics for today's session. I have a few questions of my own to ask this panelist, but I would love to put to them some of your questions and make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to add your questions in the chat box. Nirav, turning to you, you are working very closely with a market that has a very large number of non-state schools in India. And perhaps you may have some examples there of how these schools have risen to the challenge of facing the pandemic that you would like to share. And we'd love to hear, Nirav, from you.
Sure, Amit. But by the way, I quite agree with Suzanne when she says that, the sector has been very badly affected. I mean, it's been dilapidated. And we primarily work with schools that aim to achieve financial self-sustenance on the back of fees collected from parents. Now, the parents themselves have lost their livelihood, and therefore they have stopped paying fees. So some of these institutions have had no option but to undertake severe and drastic cost-cutting measures, such as, for example, in some cases, rationalizing their staff, reducing salaries, or even having to let go of the premises so that they don't have to pay the rent. In midst of all the chaos that's going on right now, and I'm actually shocked to hear the statistic that Suzanne presented, I mean, if the deficit has now increased by 100 billion per annum, that's a huge problem that the world now faces. We are seeing some green shoots, though. And if I may request for the second slide to be put up, I'd like to provide some examples here. There's this, on the left is a portfolio company of ours, which is Vartana. They provide debt to affordable learning providers in India, work with about 4,000 of them. And they, on behalf of all these learning providers, launched a technology platform so that these institutions can resume some learning for their children, their students, and in the process, at least be able to claim some fees. In the very first month, out of the 4,000 institutions they work with, 1,300 moved to the technology platform. The second example is that of a preschool chain that we work with, a daycare chain called Clay. And they have about 10,000 parents as their customers. And they offered solutions online so that the parents can take better care of their wards while they're at home. And once again, in the very first month, out of those 10,000, 2,000 parents subscribed to those online services at fees that they were otherwise paying for the classroom services. So there are these interesting examples that are emerging. In Philippines, we are seeing a budget higher education service provider, FINMA, has offered services through SMS and WhatsApp, community-based services to ensure some continuity of education. But having said all that, we are still figuring out ways to use technology. Technology has barriers. Not everybody has access to devices or to adequate bandwidth. And so it's a problem that yet remains to be solved. But in the absence of anything else, technology is being used by some of these institutions to ensure their own continuity and continuity of learning of their students. Thank you, Amit. Back to you.
I agree. Thank you for sharing that. Technology does seem to be necessary to overcome the access hurdle. And what else do we need to do on top of the building out the access to really deliver quality is the challenge that a lot of us are grappling with right now. Boyega, if I could ask you for your views, so you have worked very closely in Nigerian market and some other markets outside of Nigeria across Africa. What are you seeing from your position as the impact of COVID, and any examples where you see non-state schools have risen to the challenge that the pandemic has put them in?
Well, thank you, Amit. Yeah, a particular study conducted by TEP Center and Nigerian Economic Summit Group highlighted significant activities that supported learning during the pandemic from both state and non-state providers in Nigeria when they collected data from almost 2,000 students or respondents. I will suggest that people can check this up. But in practical terms, we talk about the impact in terms of looking at the pandemic had created opportunity for remote learning and use of technology of different forms was greatly accelerated by non-state providers. And the fact that most of the non-state providers are owned by several independent persons allow for the use of varying technological platforms for the purpose of achieving the same goal. So the diversity of ownership of non-state schools during this pandemic has created basket of innovations that their efficiency will need to be tested and measured. Having said that, also, I can quickly add that from experience from Deepin, we understand that the non-state schools, they are divided into different categories. We have the high fee paying schools, which are synonymous to high income households, and low medium fee paying schools, which are synonymous to children from low income background. So the issue of equity remains a big concern, as the infrastructure to support remote learning seems skewed at present in favor of children from high income households. A number of non-state schools simply found it difficult to deploy the remote learning access, even when they were ready, as a significant number of parents were unable to provide the support devices because of limited household income. So a quote from one of the studies said that I have more than 40 pupils in my class, only 17 parents are on the WhatsApp. So that means a number of these children are disadvantaged in terms of equity of having access to learning. But one other thing that has happened in terms of response from Nigeria is around the fact that cost reduction, dealing with the major cost driver, which is teachers' salary, was a major issue. Measures included layoffs to reduce the salary of many teachers. Half salary was also a measure. Most non-teaching staff were laid off, especially in non-state schools that run boarding houses. This was a challenging option to schools that hire a combined number of staff, and yet the sector had no stimulus during this pandemic. In Lagos State alone, the number of teachers involved are more than 200,000, and a number of them do not have salaries during this particular period. One thing I need to emphasize at this point around the impact during the pandemic is also the fact that the innovation of schools is around the regulatory overbearing behavior of the regulator in some states in Nigeria, which seems to be less enabling as they try to go beyond issues of safety by issuing orders to school, which somehow may stifle innovation and capacity of schools that are businesses from remaining afloat in some parts of the country. For instance, dabbling into whether schools should charge fees during the pandemic. It's something that I think is regulatory overbearing, which obviously affected the way and manner in which the schools as businesses responded to the challenge of the pandemic.
Yes, I agree, Boyega. Thank you for that. What should be the appropriate response? What should be a measured response is always a question. And when you are in the middle of a crisis situation like we are currently, we are of course thinking on our feet. but we are also reflecting on the last time when we had faced some kind of a crisis, and how did we respond and how did things go in that situation. And so to that end, I do want to bring in Arjun here for his reflections on a study that Arjun, you and your team had done on conflict and crisis and the role of the non-state education sector. To hear from you what you thought were some of the key takeaways from that study that those of us who are in the current crisis could benefit hearing of. So Arjun, over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Amit. Yes, happy to share some of the key takeaways from the study. Maybe to start with some context, the study on affordable non-state schools in crisis and conflict that we published in 2018 is a follow-up on a 2011 USAID paper on non-state schools more broadly. That study was supported by ECCN, the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, and the 2018 study included a literature review, a conceptual framework, and in-depth case studies in El Salvador and Kaduna State in northern Nigeria. In terms of the study's contribution to the literature, I like to think that the conceptual framework in the report is a real value add. The framework outlines 7 steps for donors and implementers to use when deciding how to engage with the non-state sector in contexts of crisis and conflict. The framework explores several concepts, starting with the nature of the crisis or conflict, the importance of understanding how crisis and conflict affects education systems, and strategies that affordable non-state schools use to overcome barriers created by crisis and conflict. And most importantly, weighing the positive effects and the potential disruptions non-state schools may have on education outcomes. In terms of key takeaways, Amit, several key findings emerged from the study, so I won't list them all here, but I'll highlight just 2. So first, we found that across the literature review and the 2 case studies, that affordable non-state schools are frequently religious in nature, and which that may mitigate or that may exacerbate the impact of conflict on education. As we all know, education is non-neutral, and affordable non-state schools may exclude certain students or communities which may promote inequality or contribute to societal divides. So this is an important factor to consider when engaging with non-state actors in situations of crisis and conflict. Second, crisis and conflict has a mixed impact on school sustainability. So crisis and conflict can impose additional costs on affordable non-state schools through lower enrollment and decreased revenue streams. But at the same time, conflict may increase the demand for affordable non-state schools, given the potential lack of education providers in the system. I'll stop here, Amit. So back to you.
Thank you, Arjun. Yes, I agree. We think of inclusion, we think of, how to meet the challenge, but often we overlook in times of crisis, issues of exclusion, issues around inequality. And I'm seeing some questions from the audience around that. I will come back to that. But Suzanne, if I could ask you, you were one of the funders for this study. You were part of the team that saw outcomes and results from the study, and you may have seen what takeaways from the study were useful or implementable as you took these lessons across to other parts of the world that you work in. So would you like to share some of your experiences and reflections from a funder's perspective on the key findings from this study?
Yes, so this study brought together experts first that normally do not speak with each other, namely conflict-sensitive experts and non-state education sector experts. The study actually persuaded the conflict-sensitive experts who were initially more reticent of donors engaging with the non-state education sector. After the study, they were convinced of the importance of and value of engaging with this sector. A second kind of outcome that came immediately after people learned about the study's finding, it directly contributed to Education Cannot Wait, embracing the value of non-state education sector in conflict and crisis contexts. Other lessons from the study is the importance to conduct a mapping of the non-state schools. Oftentimes, these schools are not recognized by the government. Either the government doesn't know that these schools exist or choose to overlook them. It is also important to conduct a rapid political economic analysis, as indicated in the conflict-sensitive framework that Arjun have pointed out, because the non-state education sector, particularly schools, can pose a threat to the government. Obviously, it is critical to have the governments on board at the start of any activity with the non-state education sector. We are applying all these lessons from the study in our new Catalyze EduFinance activities in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Rwanda, El Salvador, and Haiti. Over to you, Amit.
Thank you, Suzanne. So Arjun, I do want to come back to you to hear from you. It's been a couple years, maybe longer, since you had put this paper out. You had mentioned about some of the key takeaways from this paper. Suzanne talked about what the funders have taken away and how they have taken some of the lessons. But just looking back, what might be some of the lessons that the EduFinance community, the non-state sector, might have missed that you think are worth reminding and reflecting on as we face this current crisis? Any thoughts on that, Arjun?
Yes, thanks, Amit. Yeah, based on our findings, we presented a few recommendations for how governments and donors might productively engage with affordable non-state schools in context of crisis and conflict. And I'll just mention a few here. Across our case studies, we regularly found that government had misconceptions or little understanding of the non-state sector in general. So one recommendation that we have for government, as Suzanne mentioned, is really to map and define the variety of non-state actors and their target groups, right? As we know, non-state education is characterized by a diversity of providers, each with a distinct ownership, management, financial structure, and levels of state involvement. So understanding this continuum and defining the types of non-state schools in the system is a critical first step. The second is to ensure that the processes for registering and accrediting and regulating non-state schools are clear and streamlined. As for donors, we recommend that a critical first step is to really understand the opportunities and risks associating with engaging with non-state actors, and if possible, applying the conceptual framework when determining when and how to engage with the non-state sector. Back to you, Amit.
Yeah, thanks, Arjun. Nirav, I'm hearing Arjun, and I'm also seeing a question from the audience that I think you might be well positioned to take on. There's a question from Maria as well as from Yasmin Hossein, and I'm gonna combine the two. But just picking up from what Arjun had to say about relying on a conceptual framework, looking at a segmentation approach, looking to understand the market. When you as an investor are looking at what's happening in the markets in Asia and perhaps in some places in Africa, you see how the pandemic has affected the non-state school sector, especially the low-fee private schools. You can see the inequality that has been that's on everyone's mind. So how do you as an investor then look at this and say, what am I going to invest in? How am I going to, what's an opportunity here for an investor to participate in the non-state education in the current crisis? Any thoughts on that, Nirav?
Sure, certainly, Amit. So I'm going to divide this in two parts. One, the effect of the pandemic, and then the overall attractiveness of investing in the low-fee private schools sector. Well, the pandemic will have to be dealt with, and like all the small and medium businesses around the world are being supported, the affordable learning providers would also require a stimulus to get back on their feet. And the issue is not every government is as forthcoming as USAID in acknowledging the role that these non-state players play. And in absence of that, there is no stimulus which is forthcoming. There is no financial one-off support which is forthcoming for them. And that is a matter of concern. Now, having said that, in terms of our outlook on the long-term prospect of the sector, we believe that the sector is here to stay. There are now enough success stories from around the world which go to show that it's an asset class, if I can loosely use that word, since you've labeled me as an investor. It's an asset class which is global, highly impactful, profitable, safe, and very fast growing. So therefore, it will attract capital. And if I can use slide number 3, we have recently put out this paper where we've tried to capture the lessons that India's EduFinance success story can have for the other emerging countries. So there, our outlook's not changed. Yes, what we are likely to see is some sort of supply consolidation, because the relatively smaller player will find it very difficult to actually emerge from this huge blow that the pandemic has caused. But the demand for education and the affinity towards non-state education for parents is not going to go away, which means those players that survive will actually be able to grab the lion's share of demand that will still remain. Thanks, Amit. Back to you.
Yeah, Nirav, no, thank you. And I do want to stay with you here, Nirav, to reflect on, what you are going to see in the medium term. We are, of course, in the middle of the pandemic. We are all very focused on dealing with this. But there are other challenges that we were dealing with even before we were hit by the pandemic. The challenge of scale. How do you reach the large numbers of children across countries as large as India or Pakistan or Nigeria, and so just reflecting a little bit on that, and what suggestions or what comments would you have on the lessons learned from the markets that you have worked in terms of scaling up non-state education and in terms of looking ahead to how to continue to provide education for all. Nirav?
3 key lessons emerge, and I'm going to keep this brief, Amit. But first is very clearly, when tailored capital provision solutions, debt provision solutions are made available to this sector, the sector gets catalyzed. And that's something that India has seen over the past 12 years since the inception of the very first affordable sector-focused financial intermediary, Indian School Finance Company, and Amit, I know you were part of that story as well, was established. The scene has dramatically changed since then in India. So first of all, dedicated and tailored credit solutions make a huge difference in terms of promoting the sector. The second thing that we've seen now, and there is abundant proof on the ground, is that outcome-based reward and recognition go a very long way in improving quality at these institutions. Sometimes these rewards are even more effective than standalone education interventions that we have been historically, as education community, been so used to providing to education institutions. And finally, I'd like to once upon emphasize the fact that these institutions really promote gender equity. I mean, we know that barring Africa, majority of teachers at these institutions are women. We know that in most of these institutions, 50% of students are girl students, but most importantly, in 40 to 60% of these cases across all the emerging countries, either the promoter or the co-promoter is a woman. Thank you, Amit. That's all that I had to say.
Thank you, Nirav. We often think of inequality in one dimension, the income inequality, but the gender inequality, of course, is equally important. So we heard from Nirav's experience in India, but Boyega, if I could come to you and ask you of what are your sort of recommendations or suggestions based on what you have seen in Nigeria for the markets that may not be as large as Nigeria, but are still, coping with the challenges and would like to hear how the non-state education in those markets could grow and offer education for all. Boyga?
Thank you, Hamid. Yeah. In time, from experience gathered in Nigeria under the Deepen project, we realized that number one, data is key. The data that provides information about the non-state schools. That was the starting point for us in Lagos. By the time the data was captured, the issue of denial began to disappear, and we began to move to acknowledgement of the contribution of the non-state sector, and then gradually moving towards what we call enabling that particular sector. So for me, one thing that is key is data that provides information that can help to unlock and unblock the relationship between demand and supply of services. The suppliers of services are the private sector entrepreneurs who are essential in the value chain to enhance non-state school performance. So information about size of the opportunity in the sector is critical for the development of solutions that will drive progress and eventually improve learning outcomes anywhere. So that's number one. Number two is regulation. Regulation that enables. And this does not require huge fund. The regulation that enables rather than one that disables. Unbiased, equitable, neutral, independent, that does not intentionally or unintentionally put stumbling block on access to services that can enhance school as businesses. The guidelines for setting up schools need to be enabling and equitable, such that demand for higher requirements from non-state schools and those requirements are not applicable to non-state schools. In some instances, the demands from non-state schools are higher than state schools. So equitable situation, those things can be done quickly. In terms of action for funders, I think that funders should attempt the market system approach, which allows more to be delivered with less, with some modifications suggested in the experiment of Deepen. The Endline Independent Report of Deepen affirmed that improving the regulatory environment and access to finance are strengths of the market systems in Deepen experiment. These two areas produce results with very limited financial input from donors. The funds that were actually allocated or lent out to schools are from the existing financial market. And what is needed is stimulation and facilitation of the demand and supply by unblocking the constraints in the market. And this is what the donor can easily do with lesser funds, facilitating the unblocking of the nexus between demand and supply. And that is what happened under Deepen. Thanks.
Thank you, Boyega. If I can, Suzanne, if I can ask you to step in here and speak a little bit about your experience as a funder who looks at this from a global perspective. There are so many countries that you are looking at and working in. And we heard from Julie at the beginning of this call how USAID looks at partnerships and partnerships between public as well as private funders. So I'm curious how you approach this and what are your some of reflections on how to bring the public and private funders together to meet this scale challenge.
Thanks, Amit. So given my work with non-state education sector, my key advice is to first not to ignore the non-state education sector, especially given the current crisis. Countries are financially strapped. This is the time for USAID and other donors to make a concerted effort to mobilize all resources, which includes the non-state education sector. I think there needs to be first a recognition that individual countries, and often it may go down to an individual provincial area, that individually they are at different stages of their knowledge and engagement with the non-state education sector. Depending on where the country is at, it is important to conduct an assessment to be able to develop appropriate interventions. For example, in a country where there is already existing policy around the non-state education sector, such as in Zambia, but has deep fiscal constraints and major problems of access to secondary education, supporting a public-private partnership model where the government contracts out to a non-state education sector, like to a peace organization, promoting equality in African schools organization to deliver secondary education in hard-to-reach places is an appropriate intervention. In other contexts, such as in Ghana, where there's a large number of non-state schools in the urban areas who essentially are small, non-formal and formal enterprises primarily run by women, due to land titling issues, lack access to formal credit. In this context, USAID worked with a local microfinance institution, providing a credit guarantee and technical assistance to local business development service providers to support non-state school owners in strategic planning, financial management, and human resource management to be able to access formal credit. And in a place like Punjab, Pakistan, where there is a large number of recognized low-cost non-state schools, and the government wanted to improve learning outcomes for disadvantaged children, the World Bank assisted the government in developing a quasi-governmental organization that oversaw the non-state schools and provided subsidies to these schools, which included a successful incentive program that covered school fees when disadvantaged children improved learning, particularly reading and math outcomes. Over to you, Amit.
Thanks, Suzanne. I love hearing the different, the work that you're doing with different countries. Can you? We have an audience question here that I think Suzanne would be good if you could please respond to it. It's a question from Emily Vargas Barron, and she's asking, what tools is USAID using with different countries to ensure and to support them in quality assurance, equity, and accountability of non-state schools? Suzanne, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are using a tool that we're developing, and I think maybe Amit, you also could speak on this, and it's called what we find in the non-state school sector, that one of the biggest issues is a cross-section of the education sector and the financial sector. And one of the tools right now we're trying to build out, and we're largely drawing from the financial sector, we have something called a 5-point financing framework, a diagnostic tool. And we're tweaking it to add the education piece, to look at the equity, to look at the quality, and to look at the financial piece of the government. So that's what we're doing in particular. Maybe, Amit, you could speak a little bit, actually, because we conducted that assessment out in Zambia as well as in DRC and other places. Amit, do you want to comment on that tool and how we're tweaking it in regards to linking it with like an education finance assessment tool for the non-state education sector?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I'll take quick 30 seconds on that. The tool is a 5-point framework, and those 5 points cover all the elements that we discussed today. It covers an analysis of the policy framework, the regulations that Boyega talked about. It covers the private schools, the landscape, and the landscape of investors that Nirav and everyone else also touched upon. And the intermediaries, the facilitators, the financial infrastructure, all of which helps to come together to enable and facilitate the flow of finance between the different actors towards education, towards ancillary education enterprises, towards schools as well as parents. And that's a tool that we've had some good success in analyzing and understanding the different markets. On this topic of analyzing and understanding markets, Nirav, I do want to circle back to you on a question that is almost on anyone's mind when they first hear about low-fee private schools. Isn't there a trade-off between the commercial returns to expect from a low-fee private school and to serve the vulnerable and the marginalized population that these schools serve? So when you are faced with investors who want to understand this market and you want to inform them of what opportunity there is, what do you say? How do you explain this kind of a trade-off, and how do you look at it?
Sure, Amit. Well, if you look at the typical population breakup, at the bottom of the pyramid is, let's say, quintile 1 population, which has no ability to pay any fees. And at that quintile, trying to take even low fee non-state education is going to be very challenging. But having said that, when we start moving up, say quintile 2, quintile 3, what we've witnessed, and now there are umpteen examples, is that there is an opportunity to create not just access, quality, relevance, which we've always spoken of, but also financial self-sustainability. There are organizations now which have grown their loan book to over $100 million, which have actually been able to demonstrate that their non-performing assets or bad debts are less than 5%, which is considered to be very good, which have very healthy key performance indicators, including their profitability matrix, and prior to COVID, were actually registering 100% year-on-year growth for almost 5 years in a row. And we've only scratched the surface. I mean, just to give you an idea, the largest EduFinance provider in India, and we believe it's also the largest EduFinance provider focused on affordable learning providers anywhere in the world, works with, like I said, 4,000 such institutions. India alone has close to 400,000 such institutions, which means that there's a long way to go before we see any kind of market saturation. So there's a tremendous opportunity waiting to be uncovered, which already has a number of very successful proof points. Thank you, Amit. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Neerav. I appreciate how you thought of it as there's a long ways to go in terms of coverage. There's also a long ways to go, in my view, in terms of reaching the vulnerable and the marginalized. And I'm curious if, Boyega, if you have any thoughts on your experience with DeePan, on how the private players, private schools may have done may have covered populations that you thought were vulnerable and marginalized. Any models or examples you may like to share? 30 seconds, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I will ask our audience to please check out the Deepin Work for the Poor report on Deepin website, www.deepin-nigeria.org. Yes, exactly. The program succeeded in areas of access to finance, especially in respect to serving low-income earners, where the schools are schools that are serving low-income earners. So, for instance, we succeeded in catalyzing demand and supply in the market to the tune of 1.1 billion naira, which is $3 million for 2,400 loans lent by one financial institution, likely to school they don't usually transact business with. And the default rate was less than 1%. These are schools that actually do not have access to finance. And these are schools that have now had access to finance. And these are led on to a sustainability thing where EduFinance, a microfinance bank, came on board after ESPIN departure, and they are serving that market, and they are capitalized to another $3 million, and they are serving the low-income market. So, and these markets are markets that are serving children that are serving the poor. And so I think for us, we think this is something that has worked, it is working, and can work, and will continue to work. What we need is facilitation of the relationship between the demand and supply. And this also can be applied to even the low penetration that we are experiencing in the low-cost market relative to technology. Is trying to find out why is demand not meeting up with supply and see how we can facilitate the demand and supply side. And that's what we did under DeepIn. And the marginalized part, they were able to actually receive access to finance, which they never received before.
Yes, I agree. Baboya, thank you. Thank you for that summary. I think, those are fantastic examples. I encourage everyone to look them up. We did get a number of audience questions that we could not take on in this short time that we had, but hopefully hopefully this discussion has given you some thoughts, some valuable information, but also some ideas on where to look for more information, prompt more questions and discussion. I do want to thank you thank the panelists and thanks everyone for joining us today. I recognize we are at the bottom of the hour. Thank you, Arjun, Boyega, Nirav, Suzanne, for sharing your insights, and also appreciate the USAID Office of Education. I want to ask the audience to please take a few minutes to complete the survey at the link in the chat box on your screen. And also be sure to check out edulinks.org for the literature review and a posting of a recording of this discussion, and further answers and responses to questions that we did not have time to get to today. And there's lots of other resources on the topic of non-state education. The website is edu-links.org. And also look it up to stay up to date on more upcoming events in this series for global education learning. So thank you all once again for joining, and I hope everyone stays safe out there, and hope to speak to you all again soon. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye now.